We also have dedicating for all the soldiers, Baruch Yitzhak Ben Masha, and all the names we have here. A whole lot of names.
So we have names for people. Take a name of a soldier.
Thank you, Larry, for reminding us.
Yes.
Sasha.
Okay, we're going to do Torah Yudalid 14. This Torah is a unique one in that it's the only place that I've seen that this is actually mentioned.
This is Yudalid?
Yudalid. The only time it takes 4 different times at the word of the pasuk. I'll read the psukim in a second, but the pasuk that starts with is Bamasorah, right? Atem lechulachem teven. That's this week's parsha. Next, in 3 weeks in Yitro, it says Atem ri'item asher asitim u'mitzrayim. Then a pasuk in Dvarim it says Atem nitzavim hayom, and then in Yeshayahu it says Atem edai, right? So there are Atem Reish Pasuk. There are 4 times. This is the only place that it's mentioned that the Baal HaTurim is very known to do this kind of thing. The Baal HaTurim, not in this week's Parsha, but in Parsha Yitro, which is the second Pasuk that I mentioned, he mentions that this is the 4 times. He says here, the Baal HaTurim, let's see if it's here. Yes, it says here, Dalid Rashi Psukim, Atem Lechut Kulachem Teven, then it's Atem Ritem Asher Asitem Mitzrayim. Basically, the way that Baal HaTurim explains is that each one of these psukim, each one of the atem, explains each other. Meaning that each one of the atems, each pasuk that starts with the word atem, you needed the other one to happen first. Atem? Yes. That I don't know either. I don't know why it says atem, aleph taf with then a quote. I don't know why that is.
On the side over there, it says Masorah.
Right, I don't know why that is. Actually, good question. I noticed that also. But either way, so there are 4 psukim that start with the word atem. I'm sure there are more than 4, but the Baal HaTurim, for whatever reason, said that it's these 4 mentions of atem, that these 4 psukim that start with atem are somehow connected. And the way the Baal HaTurim explains it, it says here, is atem lechu kulachem teven, atem ritem et asher asitem mitzrayim, and then it says here, he says here, Atem edai, arba atem reish pasuk ad kan l'shano. Basically, the psukim, the Baal HaTurim basically says is that in order for us to understand atem chulachem teven, and because you have atem chulachem teven, you will then say atem ritem et asher asitem mitzrayim. That's at Matan Torah. Okay, so so he says in order to explain and to connect these verses, we have to understand. Lo haya lachem lomar atem ritem. Aval achshav she'amar atem lachem k'hu lachem teven, yachol lomar atem ritem. We have to understand. If lo haya omer atem ritem, lo haya yachol lomar atem nitzavim. V'chein below zeh shel nitzavim, lo haya omer atem edai. Basically, he's saying is that without the first one, you couldn't have the second one, and without the second one, you couldn't have the third one, and now without the third one, you couldn't have the fourth one. So now, of course, the Zera Shimshon is bothered by this entire Baal HaTurim, if you will. Not bothered as much as I need to understand the connection. I need to understand the connection between these 4 psukim to really to say is, that's a bold statement that the Baal HaTurim is making, and it's not quoted in any other midrash, because if he was, then Zera Shimshon would probably have quoted the midrash itself as opposed to the Baal HaTurim. So that being said, he basically says we have to understand what's the formula here, or how are these 4 psukim connected. And basically he's saying is that there's some sort of pattern that emerges, and basically that each pasuk, the previous pasuk, resolves a difficulty with the pasuk that's about to come next. Okay, so this is what he says. That's exactly what he's saying. He's basically there's a problem with the first pasuk, and therefore the second pasuk answers it. So he says here, the first pasuk you have seen, right? Atem ritem. That means the second pasuk atem ritem asher asitem mitzrayim. That mashenit kashu rishonim al godal hamakot shenit yasru hamitzrim bishvil Yisrael. It is that atem ritem is that alludes to the punishments, right? The suffering that they were inflicted upon the Egyptians for. One might ask that. Hold on a second here. Pasuk atem ritem. We can ask that what you have seen what I did to Mitzrayim, right? In other words, you saw what Hashem is saying, that you Bnei Israel, saw the suffering that I just inflicted, the pain and the suffering and the punishment that I just inflicted Mitzrayim for causing all the suffering that Bnei Israel did, you can ask, right? That means that the Rishonim, not the first people, but rather the Rishonim themselves ask, right? Says is the Rishonim asked the question, okay, Bnei Israel suffered, no one's questioning that. But look at the level of, it wasn't a, what's the word that you use today?
Proportionate.
Right, it wasn't a proportionate suffering, right? Right, it wasn't proportionate, exactly. That's the Rishonim asked the question right here, right? We don't have to think about it anywhere else, right? Look, I'm not making it up. It's literally right here, right? He says here, Agodel hamakot shenityasru mitzrim b'shvil Yisrael, right? The great plagues that the Egyptians suffered on account of the Jewish people, right? It's not proportionate. I'm not making it up, right? Right? Didn't Hashem say that Bnei Israel would indeed? What does Hashem say? They're going to endure suffering. Exactly. Right? Why were the Egyptians punished for enslaving? Why were the Egyptians punished? We knew that they were going to get. We knew Bnei Israel were going to suffer. Right? We knew that from the time of Abraham already. So we knew that it was going to happen from the time of Abraham already. So then. It's not really, it's not proportionate or not right that Mitzrayim gets such a big.
They were just a tool.
Right, they were just a kli. What's the big deal? We've asked that before, by the way. That question has been raised several times by the Zera Shimshon.
And then after there have been many times because they like.
Right, they took it to the next level. Yeah. Right, exactly. So he's going to say something like this. He says here, we must answer. It's not. What they struck them with the plagues. Now, what they struck them, the fact that Hashem struck them with the plagues, it's not because that Mitzrayim actually enslaved the Jewish people. Right? So he says, Moshe levaro b'shmo HaKadosh Baruch Hu sheishlach Yisrael as paro hitris negdo v'gazar gzera kasher lahem. And there it says, Atem lechu lachem tevim me'asher timtzo. So he says, if you look at the first pasuk that we looked at for Atem, the first pasuk, what does it say? Is Atem lechu lachem tevim. So what the Zera Shimshon is saying is, I want to understand the pattern. The second pasuk says Atem reitem. So the question that all the Rishonim ask is, it's not a right at the proportion. They were just Mitzrayim was just a kli. They're just the tool, the medium, right? They're just a vehicle. Why are we giving them such bad? Yes, they deserve a punishment, but this kind of punishment, So it says it's because the first punishment. What did Paro do? Paro said, "Oh, Moshe, you're here to complain about Bnei Israel. You want to take Bnei Israel out? No problem. Bnei Israel. Now he doubles down and he says, okay, now you want a leader to get out? No problem. I'll make you work even harder. So that statement is. It's not that they didn't. Yes, they were a kli. Yes, Mitzrayim were the vehicle for Hashem. But it's what they did is instead of just saying, yes, we will, they're going to work them hard, we're going to make them work hard that's unnecessarily hard. Right? So it's this, he treats Udenkin Tvaros Makom.
It connects to the earlier midrash that you read, where Moshe is saying things only got worse since.
Right.
It's exactly that.
Exactly. Hashem says, Moshe gets sent down to Paro, and he says, go take him out of Egypt. And instead of Paro saying, okay, or maybe complaining a little bit, he says, I'm going to double down and I'll make things worse. So the Atem Reitem, the second pasuk, answers the first pasuk's problem. Okay? Atem Reitem et asher asiti leMitzrayim, the suffering that caused Mitzrayim is because of what Mitzrayim did. Atem lechu lachem, right? So it's because what Paro did to you by making you work extra hard. So therefore, you see the suffering you see my suffering. You also see the suffering that I caused to Paro to Mitzrayim. Okay.
It wasn't proportionate.
It wasn't proportionate, right?
Shame.
Right. Whatever that means. Okay. Anyway, now that we've Lachen achar she'amar katuv atem k'chu lachem lechu k'chu lachem dahainu zeh azadon shel Paro. This refers to Paro's where he defied Hashem's kind of idea and he kind of really defied the whole process. It is possible to say that you have seen what I did to Egypt. דהיינו כל המכות שהבאתי עליהם, אף על פי שגם אתם עבדתם עבודה זרה במצרים, right? Didn't Bnei Israel also serve, do avodah zarah Mitzrayim? The answer is yes. They were memtet sharei tumah, right? So ho'il shelo haya ze ela mitoch teruf dat hagalut machalti lachem lefi shelo haya bedati lachiseni, right? Lo haya bedati lachiseni. Meaning what he's saying is that sure, they were so bothered by the slavery that they were compelled, they were forced. So yes, Bnei Israel, in theory, we could have said that Bnei Israel also served idols in Mitzrayim, right? And therefore, what? So Hashem shouldn't have saved them, right? He should have destroyed them also. But he says, no, I'm mochel you for that because why? Because in some way, you did it because you were under duress. But Mitzrayim, what they did, the suffering that they caused you, they did it out of defiance for what I did, right? You served Mitzrayim out of duress, out of being forced to, whatever it is. You are not necessarily, their sins were out of chaos, confusion, whatever it is. Mitzrayim did it out of being harsh. Okay, now we've just answered 1 and 2, right? The first 2 psukim. Now, now he says, makes another connection a little bit more, and then we're going to go back to the next 2 psukim. ומעתה, ועל כורחך צריך לחלק בין מי שחוטא באונס ובשגגה, ומעתה שאמרנו שיש חילוק בין מזיד לשוגג, בין אונס לרצון, יכול נמי לומר, אתם ניצבים היום. So he says, okay, now it emerges that we have to say that basically there's a difference between people who sin because they're forced to, and people who are sinning, willfully. So now we say now look what it says here. Atem nitzavim hayom, you're standing before me today. Below zeh kashel atem nitzavim, right? Without this distinction between people who suffer or who sin purposely or people who sin by mistake, right? What does he say? Look what Rashi says on atem nitzavim. It says here that which appear the curse. Oh, sorry, the fisha perosh Rashi sham. Kivan sheshamu Yisrael me'a klalot horiku pneim v'amru miyuchal amor b'zeh. Right? When in Parsha Ki Tavo, right, we list all the curses. What's going to happen for people who sin? Right? We list a whole list of sins and all the list of punishments. And Bnei Israel look at it and they're like, "We're guilty," right? And then turn around and say, "All right, we can't stand by this." Right? We've done it all. Check, right? Right? So he says, Moshe says, you stand here today. Right? Rashi says that Moshe says, you're still standing. That means that you don't, yes, even though Hashem has not destroyed you, even though you had sin. Meaning that what? That if you look at the previous pasuk, what was the previous pasuk? The previous pasuk that we understood, atem, right? Ritem, right? The atem ritem was saying is that you saw Mitzrayim suffering, right? What happened there? Mitzrayim got punished for doing things that were above and beyond what they should have done, and they sinned, and you sinned, right? You sinned because you were shogeg, kivachol, and they sinned because they were b'mezid. They did it purposely. And so now that we understand the mezid and the shogeg, now we can look at the next pasuk, atem nitzavim, which is you're standing here. Look, you're standing in front of Hashem right now. Atem nitzavim hayom kulchem. Because we were shogeg. Exactly. You can still stand. So yes, you might be scared of all the sins and the punishments that you might deserve, quote unquote, if you had done all these sins mezid, like purposely, but because you did them b'shogeg, you're still standing. Right? So that's what he says is now Mara, and so now he asks the question. Now we have to understand Mara Yahizo. What proof? How did the Jewish people survive in the past? Provide proof about the future. Maybe they just didn't. They haven't entered the covenant, the brit yet. Right, exactly. Like you said, okay, so basically what he's saying is, right? Basically, when it says "Atem nisavim hayom kochem lifnei Hashem lekochem, lifnei Hashem elokechem," it's that you were bishogeg, you did it accidentally, meaning you weren't doing it willingly and purposefully and intentionally, right? So therefore, you're saying is that the punishment was not as harsh as opposed to those who did it defiantly, as he says, and in rebellion, like what Mitzrayim did, and therefore that your ratzon, even though you might have sinned, your underlying heart, the underlying purpose, driving force is to serve Hashem. Yes, we may sin along the way, but our goal and our underlying drive is to serve Hashem. We may sin, but we're still standing, right? Now there's that. We can look at it back then. We can also look at today, right? Perhaps there is among you a man, right, who he will bless himself in his heart, thereby adding punishments, unintentional sins upon it, etc. So he's basically saying is that was set forth that the curses that the Torah sets are for sinners that actually intend to rebel against Hashem. Okay, so now that we've understood that, now we can understand the next verse, Atem Nitzavim Hayom, right? Is where is basically, we have to now explain how it connects to Atem Idai, which is the last pasuk. Right? Now that once you understand Atem Nitzavim, we can also understand Atem Idai. Without this verse, you are stating Atem Nitzavim, we have to understand Yisrael Kadosh Baruch Hu, Mayoil Kadosh Baruch Hu, right? What benefit is there, right? What benefit is there for Bnei Israel to testify about Hashem? Right? So it says if we understand, right? It says if we call it like the relationship of a father and a son, then who's pasul for edut? You're right, exactly. They're pasul for edut. Father and son are pasul for edut. Exactly. Right? ואם היו בנים, בלאו הכי חייבים לשמור מצוות האב. אלא ודאי צריך לומר שמה שקוראים בנים אין מחמת קורבה, אלא לשון חיבה. Okay, so he says, however, he's saying is that the Atem Nitzavim Kulchem is, which indicates that Moshe had to force the Jewish people with a curse, meaning that basically a curse and the oath to fulfill mitzvot. We see that without the oath, they would not be under obligation to obey the commandments. Basically, he's saying is that he says here, so he's saying is Moshe, in some ways, he had to make them swear and accept it, right? With basically to force the Jewish people with a curse and an oath to fulfill the mitzvot. That if they would not take that oath, they would never be under obligation to obey the commandments, right? And if they were truly Hashem's sons, right? Aren't they obligated to respect the father's commandments? אינו על מחמת קורבה אלא לשון חיבה. כמו שכתוב כמה פעמים בני במשלי עשה זאת אפילו בני אהבת ולרעך וכדומה. Right? וכן אומר בני בכורי ישראל. אף על פי שלא היה להם דין בכור לעבוד עבודה כמו שהיו עושים הבכורות ממש באותו הזמן. לכן אמר אחר שאמר אתם ניצבים יכול לומר אתם עדיי. Right? So basically what he's saying is that because they were accepting Atem Nitzavim, because they accepted Hashem's covenant, the oath, the brit, right? Because they're standing there and accepting the brit, then they can say is now you're because you've accepted the brit, now you can become you're kosher for edut, right? You can't be kosher for edut if you're just a father and a son relationship, and it doesn't mean literally a father and son. It means a father and son means the relationship between a father and son. It doesn't mean that we're actually like a father and son, like we always say. Right, we're not actually father and son. It's right. It's kivani, right, kivani, right, exactly. Now, this is the connection between the four atem, uviotam bereish pasuk, and the fact that it was at the beginning of the verse. Indicates that the entire discussion is only to counter the initial thought that we would have had upon seeing each of the side verses. In truth, the difficulty with each verse has another resolution. He says there's actually another answer. So he says is, Yesh l'taretz kushat atem edai. We can solve the difficulty with the verse atem edai kifi aderech shenefaresh l'kamen parashat shoftim ve'kusha shekshen al etem reitem da'inu hamakot shel Mitzrayim gam bezeh tertzu mefarshim shevi'avdu v'inu atam hu avdut kal ve'hem yichbudu olam ha'yisrael. Like we said, v'af kushat atem nitzavim adayin lo nechlesu b'levita Allah kvar tertzu v'zeh mefarshim v'gam anu netaretz b'zeh bezrat Hashem. So he's basically saying is Yes, we have to basically say is because the word atem comes first, we have to basically look at it is that this is the way that we approach it, and basically saying is that that each one of these psukim, each one of the next pasuk, the following pasuk, the following atem answers an answer, explains the question that we have with the first atem. Just a thought, a small little thought there. Okay, that's number Yud Dalid, and now we'll do Yud Gimel. Yeah, 1 second.
Little technical pause. While we're waiting, we're just going to announce again to dedicate to the soldiers. I have all the names here. Everyone should join us online at Zera Shimshon, at the Zera Shimshon or zerashimshon.com. And we have a lot of platforms, Baruch Hashem, and to give some Chaim for this holy soldier here, leading the way in the Zera Shimshon. And remember, this is a big segula to learn, to share, to bring Yeshua's, even 5 minutes. Alabai the whole time. To get your own svarim of the Zera Shimshon. We're slowly putting all the books up on the website so you can get your own copy. There's
Okay. Yud Gimel is a short one?
Yeah.
Okay. Yes, it's short. Let's put this over here.
Excuse me, everyone. Have a Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom, Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom.
Okay. So, okay. Oh, here, by the way, we're going back. Yud Gimel goes back a little bit about our whole idea of Levi not working.
Yeah, I like that one.
Okay, so we're gonna maybe this will explain the whole issue of Levi and not working. Maybe. Okay, it says, listen, it's a midrash that says it, so we can God forbid we questioning a midrash, but at least we can maybe understand it a little bit differently. Pasuk. If you go to Pasuk, Perek Hey, Pasuk Dalid, this is right after Moshe and Aaron go to. Sorry. So it says here.
That's good.
Okay. Vayomer Hashem el Moshe. No. Pasuk. Perek Hey. Excuse me. Pasuk Dalid. So it says here. Paro says. Why are you bothering Bnei Israel from what they're supposed to be doing? Go do your thing. It says here, right? Why do you disturb the people? Go to your burdens. Go take care of your burdens. Rashi says there, go deal with your work that you have to do in your own house. Meaning, go take care of your own business. Right? Or basically he's saying in a nicer way, he's saying is mind your own business. Okay? Aval melechet shibud mitzrayim lo hayta shivto shel Levi. Excuse me. That is based on the midrash that basically says is that it says sivlotechem, right, implies that what your suffering is different than the rest of the Israel suffering. Otherwise, you would have just said is go join your brothers. But because it says your burdens and it's not the same as the nation's work, right? And therefore, so we kind of learned that Bnei Levi were different in terms of their how much slavery they were suffering from. What? They didn't work. They work differently. We don't know. Okay. It says here that the reason behind this is that because Bnei Levi were going to be in the future going to be carrying the Mishkan and be the servants of the Mikdash, they were going to be such special servants of Hashem, right? Hashem basically says, okay, you're patur from slavery in Egypt. Okay. Now that might be the easiest answer, Yaakov, as to why they didn't work. It's because Hashem didn't want them to work, because if they're going to work so hard now, they won't have the energy and they won't be inspired to work later. I mean, their only goal is to be working in the Mikdash. So Hashem is like, all right, your job is going to be working hard at the Mikdash. I'm going to make sure that you don't work hard now. That's one answer. Umakshim, right? Halo stama katuv ki ger yazarcha be'eretz lo lahem va'abudum minotam va'af shebet libi b'chal zarcha ve'echav shar shalom nitkayim behem gzera zo. Right? Simple question. How is it possible? Didn't we just say that Avram was told in the Brit Ben Avitarim, right? when Hashem tells Avram, when Hashem promises Avram that you will be, you will go to Eretz Yisrael, right? Doesn't he say to them that all your nation was going to go down and suffer? So how could you say that all nation isn't Levi part of this whole nation? So how can we say that one nation is what? If it's the whole nation, then it's the whole nation. If it's not the whole nation, say that part of the nation is going to suffer, not the whole part, right? You can't have it both ways, right? So the answer must be. Okay, so this is what he answers here. So he says is we may explain that it should have written Ki Zeracha be'eretz lo lahem ger v'avadu v'nilotam. Okay, so he says is we have to. So he says here, right? Okay, we should have written the sentence that Ger Yezaracha, the book that says Ger Yezaracha be'eretz lo lahem v'avadu v'nilotam, right? Which should have been written. It should have said Ki Yezaracha be'eretz lo lahem ger. The pasuk, the Zera Shimshon reorganizes the pasuk a little bit so that the word ger is not the first part of the pasuk, but rather it's in the middle, right? And why does he say that? And they will serve them and they will oppress them, right? They would just indicate that all of our Bnei Israel are part of Avram's offspring, and therefore they are liable to be oppressed. And because it says ger, because it says the word ger, meaning sojourners or foreigners in the beginning, and then they will serve them and they will oppress them. Mashma shekzerat gerut hayta kolel l'chol mishu mizera shel Avraham v'af b'shevet Levi nitkayem shayu gam hem gerim v'avadu v'nilotam mishu ra'u la'avod ve'ino kolel l'chol zaracha. So the Zera Shimshon, in his typical fashion, he picks up on the way the structure of the pasuk, right? Almost all of the Zera Shimshon's commentaries are on the structure of the pasuk, and the psukim. Look what it says here. The way the pasuk reads is Ki ger yezaracha be'eretz lo lahem v'avadu v'nilotam. If we were trying to say that the entire nation was going to be serving, right? Was going to be liable to servitude, it should have said, according to the Zera Shimshon, Ki yezaracha be'eretz lo lahem ger, they will be foreigners, v'avadu v'nilotam. That's what it should have said. But because it says Ki ger yezaracha be'eretz lo lahem, and then it says va'avadu, va meaning implies and they will suffer. So the way he reads the pasuk, he reads it differently. He says is they will all be foreigners. Ki ger yezaracha be'eretz lo lahem. Va'avadum is a separate part of the pasuk. Va'avadum means that they will work, but they will work and they will work means that there's a separation between Levi or one part of the nation and another part of the nation. That's how he reads it. All right, and it does not include all. Not all of those considered your offspring. According to this approach, if we look at it this way, right, the first clause of the first part of the pasuk, right, applies to the entire nation, and the second part only applies to all of the tribes except for Levi, who are to suffer. In other words, Levi was not part of the suffering. Another approach. He gives another approach. The El Yeshlamar the Itaba Midrash al pasuk Vayakom El Chadash. Shemet Yosef, right? As we know that the pasuk, like the pasuk in this week's parsha, the beginning, it says, "Vayakom el chadash asher lo yadat Yosef." That when Yosef died, Heferu brit milah. Amru nihiyah kamitzrim. This was a good one also. Okay, so he says here. So it says Moshe, when Yosef dies, Bnei Israel decided to do what? They decided let's assimilate. Let's stop doing brit milah. Right? Once Yosef's out of the picture, who we know that Yosef was known for.
When they left Eretz Mitzrayim.
What?
When they left Mitzrayim.
Yes, they have to have a brit, exactly.
They have to have a brit.
Well, no, we're going to get to not a brit. No. And if you look in Perek Yud Bet, right before Makat Bechorot, right before around Chodesh Azalachem, it says that Hashem says all the people who are not circumcised, right, have to get circumcised in order to eat the Korban Pesach, right?
Okay.
So that's he's going to allude to that in a second. So that okay. So he says here, is that when once Yosef died, Bnei Israel decided to say, let's go start assimilating, right? Let's start going being more like the Mitzrayim. I'm reading what
I'm being a real pain right now,
Go
and I
for it.
realize that, but what you just said, those who aren't circumcised have to get circumcised. So what about all of those that may have been circumcised that weren't Levium, were they slaves?
That's a good question. I don't know. I'm guessing yes.
One of the reasons Zera Shimshon is giving here that they weren't slaves is because they were circumcised. The Levium were circumcised. No?
Sorry, now I understand the question better. Two separate things. His first answer was that he reinterprets the pasuk,
Okay.
and the first answer was the way the pasuk reads is that everyone will be a foreigner, but only some of them will suffer. That's how he reads the pasuk. That's one answer, and that's how he can justify, quote unquote, or explain the question that we had originally: is how could Shevet Levi not be part of the suffering? Now he says, okay. Now we have a different reasoning. Now we have to go. He says, I have another answer, totally not related to the first one. So he says the second answer he says is, let's start with the idea that when the new king, the new Paro died, after Yosef dies, it says in the pasuk, "Vayakol melech hadash asher lo yadat Yosef," right? After the new king that comes up, he didn't even know about Yosef. Whether he actually knew about Yosef or he didn't pay attention, irrelevant at this point. But the point he says is that Bnei Israel say we want to be more like the Egyptians. We're not going to circumcise ourselves anymore. V'kevan she'asu kain, hafach HaKadosh Baruch Hu ha'ava she'hayu ha'mitzrim ohavim oto l'sinah. So he says that the Holy One, the Hashem, decides to do is take the love that the Egyptians had for them. Does this sound familiar? He says he takes the love, right? What happens when he's going to mention it too, but I love this one also. He says is what happens when we get too assimilated into a nation? What happens? Our love that they start liking you because they like you because you're distant. But all of a sudden you start becoming too much like them. What happens? They start turning on you. Sound familiar? I don't know. Anyway.
Such an idea.
What? Anyway, so he says here, the Hashem says, "Oh, you want to be more like them? No problem. The hatred that they had for the love that they had for you, meaning that it's okay to live with us. You want to bring business to us? No problem. But now you want to start being like us so much." Hashem says, "No problem. I'm going to turn that love into hate." Right? And he says here, "Sheyamar hafach libam lisno." It says actually in Tehillim, and it says, I think it was yesterday's Tehillim, if I'm not yesterday, yeah, 100. Right, exactly, right before Shabbos, on Mincha Erev Shabbos, right? So he says he turned their hearts to hate Bnei Israel. Avkan kasher. Can we ask the question then? If we say that because Bnei Israel didn't want to have a brit milah, so therefore Hashem turned the love into hate, could we say then that maybe had Bnei Israel actually had a brit milah, maybe there would be no suffering? Right? Didn't we know already that Hashem promised that this is going to have to happen, right? It's the fact that they were foreigners. So he's saying is that the basic decree that Hashem tells Avram is, you guys are going to be foreigners in a foreign land. That's part one. Foreigners doesn't mean that you have to assimilate. It just means that you're not living in the land that you're supposed to be living in, right? So the way that Zera Shimshon answers the question, he says is, if we reread that pasuk that Hashem promised Abraham that they will be foreigners in their land, it's two parts. Part one is they're going to be foreigners. Part two is there's going to be suffering. But part two only happens if you don't take care of part one. Right? Meaning, if you take yourself and you say, "I want to be a foreigner," what happens? May live in Galut, but I'm keeping myself.
If you take the word itself, sojourner,
right?
That is not a permanent thing.
Right.
That means that you should not assimilate.
Correct. That's exactly what he's saying. And he's saying is because they decide not to become because they didn't look at themselves as foreigners. Rather, they said is, well, I'm already here. I might as well become part of them. So then what happens? So Hashem says, well, if that's the case, then I'll throw down the suffering, right? Because what should have happened is that they become foreigners in a foreign land. But that foreigners doesn't mean that you assimilate 100%. He just wanted you to be foreigners. But now he's saying, so that's what he says here. Im lo yizku would not be worthy, then Hashem says, I'll add slavery to it. This is what he says. He says, because Shevet Levi didn't violate the covenant of Brit Milah, Ki Shamru Mordechai, as the pasuk says in later on, Shamru in Dvarim, it says Shamru Mordechai v'Ritcha Yitzoru. Minadin Haya Shelo Hayu Nami B'Chlal Shirud Elo B'Chlal Gerut. Right? They were going to be part of the Gerut, being the part of being a part of being a foreigner, but not part of being suffering, because they never, because they upheld the mitzvah Brit Milah. V'derech zeh Nami yuvan hapasuk ki ger yazarcha be'eretz olahem shelichora be'eretz olahem hem dvarim mutarim sharei dai lomar ki ger yazarcha pshita shemisha uger eno yoshev ba'artzo. So he says is, if we look at the pasuk even more so, we say is, it seems that the pasuk is almost adding words that are unnecessary. Ger yazarcha be'eretz olahem. If you're going to be a foreigner, doesn't that by default mean that you're going to also be in a land that's not yours? Right? Simple question, right? But according to what we just said, it's very appropriate. Right? Hashem's decree was as follows: if the people will live in a land that's not there, and it will be noticeable and known that they are living in a land that's not them, meaning that they're temporary residents of a foreign land, right? That they're different, distinguishable from the Egyptians or from any nation in this case, that they have Brit Milah. Then only then you can say is that the only Zera will be that you're foreigners, right? Right? But if they will not be in a land that they're not their own and will not distinguish themselves, and they say, I want to be more like the Egyptians, right? Then you're not really saying that you're foreigners. What are you doing? You want to be locals. You don't want to be foreigners anymore. So then he says, so he says, so basically what he's saying is that Bnei Israel took it one step too further. And why did Levi not suffer? Is because they upheld the Brit Milah that the rest of Bnei Israel didn't uphold. 9:54, exactly.
Let's say Baruch Hashem.
What?
Just start telling. You're good.
Baruch Mordechai.
Good.
Keep sharing the love.
Everything is good.
Yeah.
Good
Everything
Shabbos.
is
Shabbat Shalom.
great.
Shabbos Mubarak and
Not in the
Chodesh.
middle of it,
Shvat.
hatred. What's going on?
Be